You're not getting rid of me yet. If you were here for the previous show, then I love you for it. This show has a fresh new panel, same horrid South African accent to start us off with. But it's great to see the number of people who are interested in conversations around women's sport, particularly the ones who were not born female. You're particularly welcome in this conversation, mainly because you tend to have more power than we do. And we need you to wield all that power in this direction. So it's great to have a brilliant panel of people here with me. Lisa, Flo, Tom, thank you for joining me. Why now? Why should brands be investing in women's sport? Different brands do it for different reasons. Sometimes they just invest in a team, because they want to be seen to be doing the right thing. Sometimes they invest in an individual like Emma Raducanu because she's just really amazing and she reaches into the imaginations of people who don't even really watch tennis. They just want to be brilliant and absolutely ahead of their time. So there are different reasons. Sometimes it's simply because the numbers don't lie. Why is now the time to invest in women's sport? Tom, we heard in the last session, I quoted all of these numbers from the Women's Sports Trust, and they are incredibly impressive. A fourfold, growth on the Barclays FA Women's Super League viewership year on year. That's a massive number. Tell me about your experience with this, and particularly over the last 12 months.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it is a massive number, and the growth that we're seeing across women's sport is just exponential at the moment. So, for us, what we're seeing is that customers are just more engaged with us. They're picking up more about what we're doing in society across the country because of our involvement in women's sport. And we heard Sanil talk about it earlier on. So much of that is that driven by what's going on in the broadcasting space now with the coverage that we're getting from the likes of BBC and from Sky. And so the ability for us to talk to our audiences through sport, through football, as well as having that sort of societal aspect to what we're doing, which you don't always get in certain parts of the men's game, is making such a huge difference for us.
Have you achieved your objectives? Is this what you said? Did you write down last year a fourfold increase in?
No, we didn't, because like all of us, it's early days, right? So we're not at the beginning of this journey, but we're only so far along it, and I think we all know that this is a long-term play, and that's the one thing that I would say to brands that are considering getting involved. This is not about coming in, throwing some money at it and disappearing. For us, this is about making things sustainable for the long term. And so that investment, that support, that commitment to women's sport is really, really key. And then in return, we are seeing an increase. We're seeing some of our metrics around women's football and the Barclays WSL start to catch up with the men's game from an awareness and a reach perspective with our audiences.
Lisa, being one of the women on the panel, no surprise, pitched up with notes. Some of them printed out and highlighted, others also annotated in handwriting. So Lisa, I'm going to put you on the spot and say, share what's on your notes. You guys at the Space Between have done research on this.
Yeah, that's right. So I'll take my headphones off. I'm not sure I can rock headphones, Anna Mike. So we did some research late last year into the value of women's sport fans. And the reason behind the research was very much that there was a real frustration for us that the context of women's sport was always the narrative relation to the commercial value and the value for brands was that it was small, there wasn't that much reach, vis-a-vis, therefore marketing directors are not thinking it's a great investment, they're not going to get a great amount out of it. So if there's no scale, there's no value, and that just didn't stack up for us. So the work that we do with the likes of Vitality and with the 100, we could see that there was more value than that, but nobody had really looked into it and articulated it before. So what we did is we actually compared fans of men's sport with fans of women's sport, and actually to clarify, that isn't men versus women, because the audience for men's sport is pretty similar to the audience for women's sport. It's pretty much 50-50 gender split, and there was some really, really interesting findings. The first one I think is really important to clear up, because there's often a misconception that women's sport isn't as good, that people just don't think women's sport is as good. And that's absolutely incorrect. All fans that we surveyed, there was an equal belief in the quality the competitiveness, the elite nature of men and women's sport. Okay, so there's absolutely no difference. So in terms of brands' investment, they're not going to lose any of those kind of inherent values of sport by sponsoring women's sport. And in fact, actually, it's marginally increase in value because actually people view women's sport as more inclusive, more engaging. So there's some really, really like much more positive and purposeful. So some really, really useful like extra value there for brands. But there's kind of two really, really important things that came out of our research. The first one is that if you're a brand sponsor, women's sports fans are twice as likely to recall you than fans of men's sport. So they are considerably more engaged with brand partners. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but many of those are related to the fact that women's sports fans value the brands because they understand what they're bringing to the game, literally. They understand that without Barclays' partnership with the WSL, with the FA, it won't exist in its form. It won't be able to grow, and so therefore they really appreciate that. And it's not just kind of engagement. They are 25% more likely to buy that brand. They are 30% more likely to engage. They're 40% more likely to talk about that brand with friends and family. And they're 24% more likely to think positively of those brands in women's sport versus men's fans and those sponsors in sport. So, like, really, really strong value. So what Tom was saying about what they've seen in growth in awareness and reach, they will also be seeing in terms of the positive engagement with women's sport fans as well. And there's more in there in terms of they're more purposeful as an audience. They appreciate more purposeful activation from brands. So it's great seeing what loads of brands are doing with the Euros at the moment, really taking on social issues, because again, that will engage women's sport fans much more strongly because that's what they want from brands, and that's why they choose brands. They choose those brands based on being more purposeful and aligning with their own values.
Yeah, that activist kind of way of looking at it. Flo, you play in the Allianz Prem 15s. You work as the Women's Sports Lead at MATTA, but you're also part of the Women's Sports Trust's Unlocked program. I don't know how you have time for all of these things. Maybe let's talk about the last part and then we'll get to the other ones. What is the Unlocked program and how does it help you as a player access sponsorship?
So the Unlock program is run by Women's Sports Trust, and it brings together a collective of athletes from different stages in their career. Some people are just starting out, some people are retired, but it's the whole sort of community of women's sport coming together and trying to find these opportunities in sport and where they lie. They provide workshops, mentorships, webinars, and how to us better leverage our brands. Because like we're saying, the numbers don't lie. Like the brands and what we can give to brands by aligning with women's sport is unreal, and it is delivering in a totally different way to what men's sport is doing. And we've barely scratched the surface. Like 0.5% of the global sponsorship spend in sport is in women's sport. So like the room for growth is unreal, and I think probably 0.3% of that is Barclays. And it just the space for growth is unreal, and trusts like the Women's Sport Trust and the Unlock program is just sort of fast-tracking that growth, in instilling the knowledge in the athletes so they can access what is out there for them.
You inhabit an interesting space because you are both on the field playing rugby, and then in the creative space, you're there at the nucleus of the idea. You're there where the strategy is kind of determined and the path is set and charted from. What are you learning and what are you bringing to the two things?
Well, I think women's sport is still very new in its journey, and obviously like the world of marketing has been around for hundreds of years, and sports marketing specifically, we've seen a huge journey with that. But unfortunately, what you don't know is what you don't know, and having someone sort of who's in both camps and is having the changing room chats and then is in the Zoom chats like the next day, it's quite interesting to be able to bring that level of authenticity to those campaigns, because to many people women's sport might have been the first time they're exposed to it. So to understand then what this means, how can I engage to it, how can we market it, how can we make young girls and boys around the country align to this. Having the position that I was incredibly lucky to get with MATTA as the Women's Sports Lead allows me to be able to do that in a way that's authentic, and it means that the campaigns that we put out there for me are of the next level of innovation of women's sport and truly making it sustainable and continuing to grow over the next, hopefully, 50, 100 years.
Lisa, you were talking about the opportunities and the market and the level of engagement that you're seeing from people who are already engaging and consuming women's sport. What are the challenges and the barriers here, though?
For women's sport or for the brands? For women's sport. If I was being really facetious, I would say the biggest problem is gender equality globally. Because we can talk about women's sport and we can talk about the bubble, and I can get onto that, and I can give you probably a fairly standard answer that doesn't change very much. I can talk about visibility, and I can talk about media coverage, and I can talk about perception. But the reality is, like, we need to move gender equality on. And there's a brilliant article yesterday in The Athletic by Michael Cox, and some amazing stats that actually showcase that, you know, what is the reason? Why are the 15? Is it a bit random? The 15 of the qualifying Euros teams that are competing in the next few weeks are in the top 15. How, you know, what's that all about? And actually, if you look at them, they all fall into the top 40 of the gender gap reporting globally. They are the best performing countries globally when it comes to gender equality. Political empowerment drives investment in women's programs, in women's rights, and it drives it in women's sport. And that's the reason why you see all the Nordic nations joining England and other nations too in the Women's Euros. That's why they're so successful. So gender equality drives change. That is our greatest barrier. That said, I think, you know, visibility is one of the biggest challenges for women's sport. We can sit in a bubble over the next few weeks and go, isn't this amazing? The Euros is taking over. It's going to be like last summer all over again. I'm so excited. I'm going to an event every night. I can see campaigns coming out of my ears. The reality is, women, you know, football has moved on so much. You know, in the last 2019 Women's World Cup for the semi-final, 14 million people watched that game, that England-USA game. 10 years ago, it was 1.4 million.
Wow.
1.4 million. So look what happens when you get visibility. Look what happens when you get the domestic product right. Look what happens when the free-to-air broadcasts get on board. And that's what I think you're starting to see in rugby now. You're getting a window for the women's game to have space, to not be in the shadow of the men's game. You're getting the BBC broadcasting. You're getting sponsors and investment. You're getting it sold properly. You know, let's see what we'll have in 10 years' time with the Women's World Cup this year for rugby, one in England in 2025. You know, hopefully we'll start to see those overcome. But, you know, it's got to move for all sport. It's got to move for all women's sport. We've got to see a diversity of sport, and that does come with investment.
Tom, I was standing with Jodie Cunningham, who was here a little earlier backstage now, talking about the fact that I feel like I'm living through like a very crucial period. Because she played at a time where it wasn't like it is now. And she says she knows it's just going to take off, but she feels like she's getting a very intimate look at a slice of history. Why now? From a brand's perspective, what is it about this moment that makes it crucial if you're managing some sort of investment in sport, for that to be in women's sport?
Yeah, I'd say three things. So I think, firstly, we've heard about all of the data from Lisa. And if I go back a couple of years when we started out in women's football, none of that data existed. So for brands today to get into it, it's so much easier than it was, because you've got the ability to quantify, as all brands want to do, what they're going to get back. And that's really, really, really important. We were lucky, we took a slight leap of faith. Lots of brands don't want to do that. And I think that landscape has completely changed. The second thing I'd say is that, and Flo talked about it, the level of investment within women's sport at the moment is really low. So the opportunities for brands are absolutely massive. You can take things, you can build partnerships, and you can do phenomenal things with it. But my third point connected to that is the most important one, is that I think there has to be a real link between why you as a brand and that property, that rights owner, want to work together. And it shouldn't just be about association or awareness. For me, it's all about a shared purpose, a common purpose, about building and creating something together. And I do think it links back to the sustainability. It links back to gender equality, particularly for us. That's why we're in women's football. It's about that long-term sustainable change alongside everything else that we're doing in football. And I think when you bring all those things together, exactly, why not? Why wouldn't you?
Can you give us a practical example of how you've done that?
How we've done what, sorry?
The actual being involved for the greater good of the sustainability of the project.
Yeah, sure. And actually it goes back to when we negotiated our deals. And I think Sunil said earlier on, and I know there's more money to come into it, but the landscape has changed and you aren't picking up bargains like you used to pick up. And I've always said, for me, that was that for me was one of my objectives. When we get to renewal conversations, I want them to be really bloody hard, because that means that we've done our job, we're moving women's sport on, and we're no longer in these conversations where people are saying, yeah, we'll take your money, whatever, you can have it.
Yeah.
That's not right.
Yeah.
Sorry, that doesn't answer the question. For us, it's the split of rights. It's the rights that goes into the elite game, and it's the rights that go into grassroots. And we've tried where possible to balance that investment so that we get this sort of virtuous circle of activity. There's elements of it we're not in control of, like the broadcasters, but we can certainly be in control of putting money into grassroots, into infrastructure, into training, development, so that in our situation, young girls get more access to football than they have today, but at the same time they're seeing elite sportswomen on the pitch playing, and when you bring all of that together, hopefully it leads to long-term change in sport.
Lisa, you mentioned the 10-year gap there and going from 1.4 to 14. Is the next 10 years, are we just adding a zero? Where's the next 10 years? Where will we be 10 years from now on this, do you think?
It's a difficult question, because I think with women's sport, every sport is at a different stage of its development. So if you take football, for example, and I think when the broadcast deal was announced last year with the shared broadcast deal between BBC and Sky for the Barclays WSL, Kelly Simmons at the FA said it's going to take 3 cycles of this broadcast deal to make the domestic product financially sustainable. Let's just think about that for a second. It's going to take another It's going to take another 10, 12 years for football, for women's football, which in this country is probably the biggest of our women's sports, to be financially sustainable. So let's just think about that for other sports. What we've got to move everyone in the same direction. So, I really think to see more diversity of women's sport. At the moment, yes, we see a lot of football. We're starting to see more of rugby. We're seeing tennis at the moment at different times of the year. But it's more diversity, more visibility of diversity. But for me, women's sport in sport is the biggest disruptor the sports industry has. It's the biggest opportunity that sport has. If you look at Nike, the apparel market is 1.5%, the women's apparel market is 1.5% of the men's, and yet it's only 30% of their revenue. That is an enormous opportunity, and we've got to invest in that to make sure that we push to make sure we've got financial sustainability and much more visibility in 10 years' time.
Amazing. Flo, your hopes and dreams for 10 years from now?
As much as I love my job, it would be great if I didn't need to have one. My boss in the crowd, so I won't say that too much. But it's great to have people on the field and off the field, like having our backs and seeing those stats come out, and just more people knowing those stats, and tournaments like the Euros coming up, and like it really is showtime for women's sport as the lead campaign line for that. And it really is that time that people need to be inspired of every age. And it's not just about inspiring young girls, but inspiring young boys to be more responsible, and that really pushes the gender equality alignment with it. It's not about we want to create more spaces for female athletes to play rugby or other sports professionally. We want to create more spaces for more people to enjoy all sport, because men's sport is relatively saturated, women's sport is not. Like, the room to grow there is just exponential, and how you market that, I really think, is going to be like the turning point, and how we market that to different audiences, leverage new brands, leverage new investment is going to be the key to growing that, and sport will just grow like fourfold, as we're already seeing.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much for the amazing work that all 3 of you are doing in this space. And I'm really excited for everyone here. If you have questions or you'd like to get in touch with any of our 3 panelists, then today is your opportunity. This screen is very hot, so I'm going to tell them to get up now so that they are not roasted alive in the next 3 minutes. But thank you so much to every single one of you for joining us. It was great to see you. Cheers.